Members, I would like to advise the Assembly that I have been notified that Mrs Palm Cameron resigned as the Chairperson of the Assembly and Executive Review Committee with effect from the 6th of July 2021. I have also received notification from the nominating officer for the DUP that Mrs Palm Cameron has been nominated to fill the vacancy of Deputy Chairperson of the Committee for Health, and that Mr Peter Weir has been nominated to fill the vacancy of Chairperson of the Assembly and Executive Review Committee with effect from the 6th of July 2021. And I am satisfied that the requirements of standing orders have been met. Members, having been given notice by not less than 30 members, I have summoned the Assembly to meet today for the purpose of debating a motion on the British Government proposals for Troubles Amnesty. Clerk, please read the motion.
That this Assembly believes that victims and survivors should have a full, material and central role and input into the content and design of structures to address the legacy of the past, rejects the proposals contained in the British Government's Companion Paper 498, addressing the legacy of Northern Ireland's past, for a statute of limitations in relation to criminal investigations and prosecutions, and its further proposals in relation to current and future civil cases and inquests, further believes that these proposals do not serve the interests, wishes or needs of victims and survivors, nor the requirements of truth, justice, accountability, acknowledgement and reconciliation, recalls the approach to dealing with legacy of the past agreed at Stormont House, which also forms the basis of an international treaty between the UK and Irish governments, calls on the British Government to withdraw its Command Paper 498, further calls for a commitment by all parties and the British and Irish governments to truth, justice, acknowledgement, accountability and reconciliation as essential to address the requirements of victims and to demonstrate how these requirements will be addressed in legacy arrangements, and calls for this Assembly to renew its commitment to address the legacy of the past, fulfil the requirements of truth, justice, acknowledgement, accountability and reconciliation, and to oppose the British Government introducing legislation to oppose its proposals.
Thank you. And before I call Ms Nicola Mallon to formally move the motion, I wish to make some brief remarks pertinent to today's debate. Freedom of speech is important to guaranteeing free and frank consideration of business in this Assembly. In that context, Section 50 of the Northern Ireland Act provides that for the purposes of the law of defamation, absolute privileges attach to the making of a statement in the Assembly. However, absolute privilege should not be confused with the parliamentary privilege enjoyed by the Houses of Parliament at Westminster. It is for a member to decide whether he or she might benefit from the Assembly's privileges for the purposes of the law of defamation, but the statutory privileges of this Assembly go no further. In particular, Section 50 offers no protection should a member be prosecuted for contempt of court. I have a specific duty to prevent any conduct which might constitute a contempt of court, and if I think that a member is straying into that area, I will require that member to sit down. Members will be aware of the sensitive nature of today's debate. Members should bear in mind, therefore, that when they contribute to the debate, they are not just speaking to their own political base, which is absolutely very important, but also to a much wider audience of people from other parties and different political perspectives, as well as many people who have been bereaved or who have suffered as a result of our conflict. If that is clear, I'd like to call Ms Nicola Mallon then to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move the motion.
Thank you, Ms Mallon. The Business Committee has agreed to allow up to 1.5 hours for this debate. You will have 10 minutes to propose a motion and 10 minutes to wind. All other speakers will have 5 minutes. Ms Mallon, please open the debate.
Mr Speaker, last week people and parties across Northern Ireland were stunned at the proposals from the British Government. Stunned that the way this Government is proposing to deal with the pain of the past is to sweep it under the carpet, to let the perpetrators, state and paramilitary, walk free and instead condemn the victims and their families to a lifetime of pain and suffering through the denial of hope, truth and justice. Mr Speaker, haven't they waited long enough? Haven't they suffered enough? It is the victims who have lost. not only the greatest loss of all by losing their loved one, but now they stand to lose the possibility, the hope of truth and access to justice. Here we are again, recalled as an assembly to discuss yet another serious political issue. But I know the belief that it is right and important that we do so is one shared across this House, across our society, and most importantly, it is the least that we can do for the victims and survivors of our terrible conflict who are devastated by this proposed amnesty. Legacy is a very difficult and sensitive issue. This debate will be difficult given the pain, hurt and loss that has been endured by people in this House and those we represent. But I appeal to members to keep in their minds the outpouring of hurt expressed by victims and survivors across our society, and the fact they will be looking to us today not to engage in mutual recriminations. That does not serve their needs or help them in any way, but to be united in standing with them and in opposition to this amnesty. In the SDLP, our support for the victims of the conflict and their families has never wavered, from Derry to Ballymurphy, through Omagh, Greysteel, Loughin Island, the Shankill Road, from the early stages of the Troubles to the present day. Far, far too many of our towns and villages have come to be associated with horrendous acts of atrocity, the lasting impact of which is actually hard to imagine unless directly affected, like so many families have been. I want to be clear. I didn't lose any family members directly in the conflict, and I am so thankful for that. I do not know what it is to stare at that empty chair day after day, year after year, filled with questions and little chance of getting answers. But I do know that the chance of an answer, the chance of seeing justice served, means everything to the families, and neither Boris Johnson nor Brandon Lewis has the right to scrub that small chance on a Tory-pleasing whim. Last week, out of the blue and without a single thought of the trauma being heaped upon the families of the victims of the conflict here, the British government told them that they no longer mattered. They should really just be quiet, move on, and forget about their search for answers and justice for their husbands, wives, children, parents, uncles, aunts and grandparents. The proposed ending of prosecutions, inquests and even investigations is not a detailed proposal which has emerged from a painstaking inclusive process involving victims and survivors and the political representatives from this Assembly. It is not a new agreement signed off by the two governments and guided by international expertise. No, it is instead a unilateral move by the British government to deliver a Tory party answer to a problem created by that same party and its backbench MPs. Backbenchers who have created a bogus myth that an endless parade of veterans are being dragged through the courts here to answer for their past, when the fact is that is not true. Rather than debunk the myth and deal in facts, Boris Johnson and Brandon Lewis have decided to cruelly abandon victims and survivors as they play to their gallery. Often when someone is speaking among friends, their guard comes down, and that seems to be what happened with Brandon Lewis as he wrote for the Daily Telegraph last week. Among his hypocritical wordplay, he explained that because the state kept records of what happened in the conflict, the grim threat of a possible prosecution hangs over veterans. The grim prospect of prosecution. To Brandon Lewis, I say, truth is not a grim prospect. Accountability is not a grim prospect. Transparency is not a grim prospect. Decency is not a grim prospect. But regrettably, it is in short supply in Conservative Party headquarters. This plan from Number 10 to ban investigations, civil cases and fold the legacy inquest process to, quote, draw a line under the Troubles to enable the people of Northern Ireland to move forward, has done nothing more than devastate and re-traumatise survivors and the families of victims. It hasn't drawn a line. It has made the situation worse. Let me say this unequivocally. Murder was wrong. The violence was wrong. And the suffering left behind by men and women wearing uniforms or balaclavas was wrong. It was always, always wrong. No one here wants to return to the past. Certainly no one wants to relive the destruction of those dark days. But for the victims and survivors of the Troubles, that is not a choice they have. Every day they live with the horrific pain of the past. Yet this British government, in doing this, is telling families that their loved one's life didn't matter, that their lives, their family's loss, isn't worthy enough to be properly investigated in a process with integrity. It is disgusting, and Mr. Speaker, it would not be acceptable in any other modern democracy in the world, and it cannot and must not be deemed acceptable here. The loved ones of those brutally murdered during the conflict are realistic about the chances of prosecution. They know no one can honestly promise justice to them. But they also are right in the fact that no one morally can or should be allowed to deny them justice, to extinguish the hope they are entitled to have. Martin Luther King reminded us that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. This UK government is seeking to halt the chance of justice. In its ignorance, arrogance, and complete lack of compassion, it is determined to intervene in the arc of the moral universe. And we will not stand silently by and allow them to do this. We have been here before in 2005. Victims spoke up then and overturned that proposed amnesty. Just as the SDLP stood with them then, we continue to stand with all victims and survivors today and every day. But also, Mr. Speaker, victims and survivors deserve honesty from us and those who sat on these benches before us. Our peace process is held up as an exemplar across the world. But when it comes to how we have treated victims and survivors, we are not the model to follow. The different failures at different times by parties here, by processes and by governments, to comprehensively and sensitively deal with legacy has created the opportunity for the situation to be abused as it is now. So my appeal today, Mr. Speaker, is that we not only unite in our opposition to this proposed amnesty for state and paramilitary actors, but that we also have a shared determination to act to properly deal with legacy. This move by the British government has to be a wake-up call. We should never have needed this wake-up call, but we now need to act before it is too late. In the recent past, we have come to sometimes difficult agreements on how some very sensitive matters should be handled. We got there on policing, on parades, on the Good Friday Agreement itself, on the restoration of devolution just 18 months ago. What was the template for resolving these serious problems, for unlocking the political gridlock which too often threatens to stymie progress here in the North? It was working together, working hard together, all the parties, the two governments, sometimes with international guidance and expertise on hand too. There is nothing easy about politics in this place, but just because it's difficult doesn't mean it isn't worth doing. There is a way forward through the agreed Stormont House. It isn't perfect, it isn't the best agreement, but after being through so many failures of the other better options, it is the only agreement and was reaffirmed in New Decade, New Approach. Victims and survivors are alive to its shortcomings, but it has broad support. It is a starting point, and by listening to and working with victims, families and survivors, it can and it should be improved. Victims and survivors have been let down for far too long. We won't be able to move forward by leaving them behind, and as a society, we should be ashamed that to date we have done just that. So again, Mr. Speaker, I appeal to all members across this House. Let us stand with all victims and survivors and against this amnesty. And as we unite in our opposition, let us give a commitment based on a shared determination to finally, properly and justly deal with our past.
Thank you, and I call Mervyn Storey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In coming to this House today, we must be very sensitive and mindful of the many thousands of people in Northern Ireland and further afield who feel betrayed and let down by the actions of Her Majesty's Government. While we would have concerns about some of the wording of the motion, and would have supported the amendment by the Ulster Unionist Party, which wasn't accepted. We do not want any other message to come from this House today other than victims cannot and should not be ignored in this way. A phrase that has often been used in our troubled past is that of perverting the course of justice. And sadly, the recent announcement by the government is the ultimate manifestation of just that. However, not for the first time have governments at Westminster, aided by willing accomplices in this chamber today, removed some of the very basic elements of a society that believes in doing what is right and not just what is politically expedient. The road to the government's latest announcements is littered with numerous acts of perverting the course of justice, actions that were designed to protect the victim maker rather than deliver justice to those who suffered at the hands of terrorists. The release of prisoners in 1998, a guarantee that anyone convicted in the future would only serve 2 years in jail. Legislation to ensure that illegal guns decommissioned could not be tested ballistically, so that those who used those guns in their murderous campaign of the innocent could not be brought to justice for their crimes. Letters of comfort, royal pardons, all done not to bring justice to the victims of terrorism, but rather to shield and protect the victim makers. The government's position paper claims a criminal justice approach is in stark contrast to the wider aims envisaged in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement of promoting societal reconciliation through acknowledgement, recognition of different narratives and information recovery. For the Belfast Agreement's provisions to be now cited as justification for this acceleration in the denial of justice for innocent victims is a sad reflection on those who signed up to such an agreement. My party opposed that agreement and likewise rejects these plans. The real test of any fresh approach to legacy was ensuring the focus of investigations was balanced and proportionate, given that the majority of murders were carried out by paramilitary terrorist organisations. Rather than find an answer to this difficult and sensitive question, the Secretary of State seems to have chosen a path which finds equivalence between the soldier and the police officer and those who planted the bomb or pulled the trigger. This, Mr. Speaker, is morally reprehensible. Nobody denies that the passage of time presents prosecutorial difficulties, but the answer is not to arbitrarily close down legal routes for innocent victims. This holds implications for the integrity and the foundations of the criminal justice system, not just in Northern Ireland but across the United Kingdom. And surely yesterday's revelations in regards to the murder of Tom Oliver, I trust, is a reminder that they are tentatively close to bringing to justice those who carried out that heinous crime. Then we've had the recent comments by the Deputy First Minister, accusing the government of covering up the truth and putting its forces beyond the law, while ignoring Republicans' blinded vision of the truth. Sadly, the standard used by the party opposite when it comes to truth was put on display for us all to see when the late Martin McGuinness told the Bloody Sunday Inquiry, "I cannot answer that question because there is a Republican code of honour. For me to identify those people would be a betrayal." What of the denial for 40 years of the involvement of the IRA in the abduction and murder of Jean McConville, or the murder of the postal worker Frank Kerr, or who knows what about the murder in this House of Robert McCartney? Thursday of this week will be the 44th anniversary of the murder of a prison officer, Thomas Fenton,
Time's up.
from Cloughmills in my constituency. I passed the place where he was murdered on my way here today. Let his memory not be sullied by these proposals, and I trust that they will be given the rejection from this House that they deserve.
Thank you, and I call Michelle O'Neill.
And I also rise to speak in favour of the motion. And I think that we have an opportunity today in this chamber to send a very clear message to the British Government that there can be no amnesty for state forces, and also that we reject their proposed interference in the legal process. I think for any stretch of the imagination for the British Government to present these proposals as an attempt to promote reconciliation is disingenuous, it's misleading, and quite frankly, it's a lie. And I think the question that we all have to ask ourselves here today is why, at this time, is the British Government bringing forward these proposals? In my mind, it's very simple. It's because the British political system cannot handle the truth. The British Government fears the bravery, the courage and the resilience of the families who speak truth to power. Their amnesty proposals are a direct response to all those successes and the effective campaigning by families and by their legal teams in securing truth through the courts. And this is something that doesn't just impact on some families, on a few families, on a section of families. This is something that is an affront to all families. These proposals are about denying them their rights. I've spent some time engaging with families, and all the families that I have spoken to are not buying what they've heard, and neither is Sinn Féin. The British state have nowhere else to turn, and rather to face up to their human rights obligations to victims, they are now poised to wreak havoc on the legal system here, rather than face up to the consequences of their dirty war. The legacy proposals to deny families any legal redress to justice is a statement of moral bankruptcy. The British Government approach is cynical because they're seeking to insulate their forces from legal challenges by shutting down the established legal options that are open to families. So today we must send a very clear message that any political attempts to interfere in live and pending legal proceedings will be resisted by everyone across this House. During the talks that led to the Stormont House Agreement in 2014, all parties in both the Irish and British governments all registered their opposition to the introduction of any form of amnesty. Indeed, Sinn Féin made that very clear in our response to the consultation. Over 17,000 people responded to that consultation, and in the aftermath of that, in the British Government's own analysis of the legacy responses, consultation responses, they made it very clear that a majority of all respondents to that process were opposed to an amnesty. Yet here we are today in this very scenario. Ceann Comhairle, we must ask, is it right that a central party to the conflict is unilaterally seeking to place its forces beyond the reach of the law? And we must further interrogate their true motivation, for I can tell you that the families that I have spoken to have no sense that the British intent is about facilitating reconciliation or making their lives better. These proposals go way beyond an amnesty for British soldiers into political interference with due legal process in respect to the halting of legacy inquests, judicial reviews, civil cases or prosecution cases involving British soldiers already before the courts. It actually places the British Government to the right of Pinochet's military dictatorship in Chile. These proposals are about more than providing legal protection for those that wore uniforms. They're actually about protecting those who wore suits. They're about protecting those in the upper echelons of the British political, military and intelligence world who designed, who facilitated and who covered up the policy and practice of British state terrorism involving state killings, torture practices in the interrogation centres, and also who presided over weapons importation and the administrative practices of collusion. Ultimately, these proposals are designed to insulate and protect the British politicians at the highest level of government, people like Thatcher, who oversaw a policy of systemic state violence against Irish people. A campaign of state-sponsored murder and cover-ups, which was manifested on the streets of Derry, Ballymurphy, Spring Hill and the New Lodge, a policy of collusion which armed and directed loyalist paramilitaries, which resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Irish citizens, including many in my own constituency. At its core, these proposals are designed to protect the British state and conceal their role in the conflict in Ireland. So when I listen to Brandon Lewis, I can draw no other conclusion than that the British Government not only don't listen, they don't want to listen, and they also don't care what victims and families think. Frankly, it's an insult to our collective intelligence to dress these proposals up as assisting reconciliation. These amnesty proposals are the antithesis of reconciliation. So as parties, despite all of our different standpoints, we must make common cause and oppose and object and challenge these proposals at every turn.
Thank you, Gora Maggott. And I call Doug Beattie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I first of all thank the Minister for bringing this motion forward. It's an important debate, and it's right to have a recall for us to debate this. And I do think on the main thrust of the issues at hand, we all stand together, and that is certainly for the Ulster Unionist Party is we do not support a statute of limitations, and we do not support an amnesty. In fact, we warned of a statute of limitations and what it would lead to as far back as 2017. And we have been quite clear that be you a soldier, a policeman, a terrorist, a member of the public or a politician, if you break the law, then you should face the law. And everybody deserves the opportunity to get justice. Doesn't mean they always will, but we cannot take away that hope. But we must also challenge those people who spin lies or spin untruths, or try to push out that they are cleaner than everybody else. If you support the Stormont House agreement, you support a de facto amnesty, and you do. Because under the Stormont House agreement, if you were left limbless, blind, burned, in a wheelchair, psychologically damaged, you do not get an investigation. If you were kidnapped in Northern Ireland, taken across the border, tortured and murdered, no investigation. No investigation for those who's in Birmingham, Warrington. No investigation in Dublin, Monaghan. Because that's what the Stormont House agreement says. And if you had a HET desktop review, you do not get an investigation. That's the Stormont House agreement that everybody's telling me we signed up to. And for those who say, no, we can change that, there's there. That's the agreement from 2016. That's the agreement that they wanted to submit in 2016 in detail. And you can read it, and it tells you exactly what I've just laid out, and that is all of those people would not get an investigation. Therefore, the perpetrators would get away scot-free. We relegated attempted murder to a misdemeanour, and people in here support it as best practice. It's not acceptable. And for those who say, yes, but the police can then investigate it. So the police can't investigate Article 2, but they can investigate Article 3. Unless you write to the police, which I did, and the police say about Article 3, non-fatalities, there is no binding legal obligation upon the PSNI to proactively re-examine these cases. So there would be nothing. And that's fact. Yeah, of course.
We had a meeting last night with a victims' organisation, and they indicated that their conversations with victims who have been injured, their main concerns were their quality of life now, whether they were getting their pension, adaptations to their house. And legacy actually came further down the list whenever they had really drilled down and done qualitative and quantitative research with them in engaging. I think what you're indicating here is that their primary objective is a legacy inquest, where I'm saying that our understanding in many ways is that they want to make sure that their life is full of quality now. Would the member agree?
The member would agree.
The member has an additional minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, the member would agree. If that's what they want, that's what they should get. But I'm talking about a societal issue here. I'm talking society is relegating attempted murder, and we should not be relegating attempted murder, and we should not be allowing the perpetrators to get away scot-free. And let's remember as well, the Stormont House agreement was a political construct. It wasn't victims and survivors who put into the Stormont House agreement. It was political parties who put into the Stormont House agreement. But I'll raise the second issue, and that second issue is this. What has the Irish government done? As I stand here and I can say and look at the British government and I say, you're wrong on this, your command paper is wrong, and absolutely support that command paper should be taken away and we redo it. If I can stand here and say that, I can't say that to the Irish government because they have produced nothing, no command paper. Thousands of attacks emanated from Ireland across the border to maim and kill our citizens, and they retreated back across the border, and they are not investigating. Where is their HIU? Where is their Legacy Investigations Branch? What are they doing? The answer is nothing. And I'll say to the party across there, who's an All-Ireland party, tell me how many times you've raised that in the Dáil. How many times have you stood up and said, why are you not doing more about legacy and the attacks that emanated from this soil into Northern Ireland and further afield? If you're not, then you're failing as well. Because I tell you, silence is as bad as putting forward these recommendations. Putting forward nothing is as bad as putting forward these recommendations. And we've got to remember as well, Tom Oliver, and I think it was mentioned by the member earlier, his family deserve truth and justice. But was it not Gerry Adams says it would be unproductive to put the people guilty of his murder behind bars? Was it not Mary Lou MacDonald who said only last year that the campaign of terror was justified? And yet people stand up and say they are supporting victims. There is a hypocrisy in this place that is absolutely astounding. And it's coming from all quarters, and from quarters I wouldn't expect it to come from, and from quarters I would expect it to come from the very quarters who excuse, condone, promote and eulogise the murder of our citizens and the maiming of our citizens. So let's be honest, let's widen the lens. We need to look at this, and we need to look at this properly. What we have now is not workable, neither is the Stormont House Agreement.
Thank you. And can we please bring Naomi Long on screen? The member has 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's both desperately sad and utterly shameful that we have had to gather here today to denounce the proposals by the UK Government to introduce what they have termed a statute of limitations, but what is in effect a full amnesty for all those who committed murders and atrocities during the Troubles, whether in uniform or in terrorist organisations. Since the UK Government unilaterally resigned from its commitment to the Stormont House legacy process, it is claimed to have been pursuing intensive engagement to find an alternative. I cannot speak to the truth or otherwise of their claims, but for my own party and most others in this House, we have not been party to that engagement. More importantly, neither have the victims and those organisations that represent their views. Their absence from any such engagement is writ large in the absence of their best interests at the heart of the Government's current command paper proposals. They are neither victim-centred nor victim-focused. To the contrary, both the proposals and how they have been spun out in the media before any victims' groups were even aware they were coming have re-traumatised many families, compounded the hurt and sense of abandonment which they feel, and has sought to rob them of any remaining hope they had that they might ever see justice for their loved ones. We do know, however, that there was engagement at Lambeth Palace, not with victims or elected politicians, but between both governments and those purporting to be senior Republican and Loyalist representatives. Of course, perpetrators of violence might well find an amnesty attractive. It would be helpful, however, if the Government would be fully open and transparent about that engagement and what role it had in the formulation of these proposals. In that context, Mr. Speaker, it is little wonder that victims of organisations with whom my party colleagues and I have engaged since last week's announcement, from right across the spectrum of victims here, have little trust or confidence in the Government's reassurances that these proposals are designed to improve truth recovery, but rather see them as a means to yet again evade its responsibilities. To date, the Government has trailed an idealised destination, but offered no detail as to how it proposes to get there. Sadly, this lack of realism is undermining public confidence in the law rather than strengthening it. The idea that, for example, freed of the risk of prosecution, those who committed some of the worst atrocities in our past will have a sudden change of heart and come forward to share what they did, to show contrition, or to apologise to the bereaved is quite frankly for the birds. Far more likely, based on current experience, is that perpetrators will be emboldened to speak freely of what they did and continue to build the mythology that surrounds so much of the brutality and cruelty of our past, safe in the knowledge that they will never be held accountable in this life. And all the while the bereaved would be forced to watch on powerless, a complete travesty. And what of those engaged in terrorism still? What kind of message does this send to them and to their victims in the here and now about the commitment of government to pursuing justice in their cases? The Secretary of State's proposals are profoundly flawed and not grounded on the needs of victims' families for truth and justice. In their current form, they are incapable of delivering closure and reconciliation. Instead, they risk undermining the rule of law and are a recipe for decades in the courts, focusing on challenging and unacceptable interference in due legal process and practice, rather than truth recovery and justice. Now, those cynics among us might suggest that that too suits the Government's purposes. for it deflects efforts away from the search for justice and truth and places yet another barrier in the way of families in their long battle of attrition in the hope of wearing down their resolve. The government claims the Stormont House agreement is undeliverable despite being a model which has international recognition, support from the majority of affected families and most of the Northern Ireland parties. And whilst I would be the first to acknowledge that the agreement is imperfect, it has the advantage of being comprehensive and ECR compliant, which is more than can be stated in respect of the current Amnesty proposals. We would therefore be much better engaged in fine-tuning those proposals, rather than casting it adrift and clambering on an uncertain life raft of unilateral government proposals, an uncertain proposal more attuned to the demands of a narrow Tory veterans lobby than the wider interests of victims, veterans and their families. With respect to the talks, whilst I have serious reservations about the government proposals, we will engage in that process, but we will do so on the clear understanding that we are there to fight against these proposals, not to facilitate them. To be successful, discussions require openness, honesty and trust. To date, all of these have been in short supply from government in respect of their proposals. So to be clear, Alliance's continued engagement is conditional on options which include continued access to due process remaining on the table in a meaningful way. Building a new future for Northern Ireland requires us to address the legacy of the past with openness and with courage. That requires truth.
Thank you.
It also requires justice.
Thank you. I call Peter Weir.
Mr. Speaker, as someone born in 1968, I think I can be rightly described as a child of the Troubles. Fortunately, I think more recent generations have been able to enjoy their childhood with much greater peace and freedom. I can, however, be thankful that due to the dedication and service of the security forces, ensuring that our country did not descend into greater chaos and anarchy, I was sheltered from the worst excesses of the Troubles. And I'm also grateful that I did not lose, as with the proposer of this motion, I did not lose any close family member to the ravages of terrorism. That is one reason why I feel I have no moral authority to in any way circumscribe or curtail the rights of families of victims of the Troubles, and therefore how much less right to impose an unjustifiable amnesty on those families as the Prime Minister or the Secretary of State, whose direct connection with the Troubles was an occasional glimpse on a news story on the television. Growing up through the Troubles taught me three basic principles which I think are still equally relevant today. One, the sanctity of human life. Secondly, respect for and adherence to the rule of law. And thirdly, that everyone should be equal before the law. It was the clear breach of those three principles through the early release of paramilitary prisoners was one of the principal reasons why I opposed the Belfast Agreement. And while I think, to be fair, some who supported it did so with extreme reluctance. The early release of convicted terrorists perverted the criminal justice system and put in place a hierarchy of both victims and perpetrators, sending out a clear message through the massively reduced tariff to Troubles victims' families that their loved ones were of lesser value than the victims of other crimes. Sadly, the early release scheme was not the only attempt during the past 2 decades to circumvent and undermine the criminal justice system. Through the securing of royal pardons, through the on-the-run letters, and the wider attempt to negotiate amnesties for Republican terrorists at Western Park. Now, while I welcome the political consensus which has emerged against these proposals, although I think it was disappointing that the Deputy First Minister did not utter one word with reference to the victims of Republican terrorism today, I think that some of these proposals, that some parties must bear responsibility in part for their genesis. However, measured against the three tests of sanctity of human life, adherence to the rule of law and equality before the law, the current proposals make what has gone before seem mild by comparison. The families of victims of the Troubles reflect the widest possible spectrum in our society within Northern Ireland and beyond. Their loved ones were the victims of a range of perpetrators, with all murders from whatever source wrong. Given the diversity of community background, unsurprisingly, victims often reflect different views and different objectives. However, it is clear that so unacceptable are the current proposals that victim families have united from across the piece to reject them. For many victims' families, the quest for justice to succeed is going to be extremely challenging, and indeed less likely with the passage of time. But it should not be the role of the state, or indeed any politician, to extinguish that possibility and opportunity. We should listen and respect their voices, and more importantly, so should the government, and withdraw the command paper. To highlight just one aspect of the iniquitous proposals, statutes of limitations are very rarely used in British law. They are principally focused on civil cases which by their nature do not seek a criminal sanction, and in some cases where there is low-level criminal prosecutions. These are restricted to summary offences, and until now any crime which can be treated as indictable and carry a potential sentence of 6 months or above cannot be subject to a statute of limitations. Crimes which can be indictable include the failure to notify the movement of cattle, the unauthorised use of a trademark, and taking a vehicle away without consent cannot be subject to a statute of limitations, but under these proposals, taking a human life will be. That, starkly, is how perverse these proposals are, and why we must resist them in a clear and unambiguous manner. It was said, I think, many years ago that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. But with respect to the Prime Minister, peace in Northern Ireland was won by the service and sacrifice of our security forces, and collectively it was at the expense of the lives of over 3,000 military and civilian personnel. Let us send out, this delivers neither truth, justice nor reconciliation, let us send out a clear signal and united voice that this House rejects them, and more importantly the people of Northern Ireland rejects these proposals.
Thank you. And I could now call Jerry Kelly. Could I remind all the members they have up to 5 minutes to speak, and we have more members wishing to speak than time to allow them to do so. So could I ask members to stick to the time allocated? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll rise to speak in favour of the motion, and I'll try and keep to 5 minutes. Today, this Assembly has an opportunity to stand together and send a message to the British Government that we all reject any form of amnesty or statute of limitations for British state forces or non-state forces, and that we also reject any interference in the rule of law and administration of justice. If the Stormont House agreement was about separating legacy investigations from current policing, then these amnesty proposals, if legislated for, will undermine the entire justice system and democracy itself. Such legislation would bring an immediate end to all criminal investigations into conflict-related offences, such as those by the Police Ombudsman, the Coroner's Courts, and indeed civil courts. That would have a far-reaching implication for confidence in the administration of justice and the rule of law. We can be in no doubt that these amnesty proposals are about more than an amnesty for British soldiers. As was mentioned earlier, it's not just about the squaddies. This proposal is protecting those behind the scenes, those in suits, those shadowy figures in the upper echelons, who facilitated state killings, who designed torture practices in interrogation centres, and those who presided over weapons importation and the administration and the administrative practice of collusion. While amnesty for state forces is the intent of this British Government, as well as the intent of ripping out the European Convention of Human Rights from the centre of the Good Friday Agreement, let's remember that they are proposals at this stage. And I think it's important to say that. We're in a small window, a short window of opportunity, but they are proposals at the moment, and the intent here must be to prevent it coming in. So if we're serious about upholding, protecting and respecting the rights of victims, then together we must resist and reject these proposals. In no way do they give cover to any public body, including the Office of the Police Ombudsman or the Coroner's Courts, to delay or halt current processes or the publication of reports. And there are outstanding reports there. So I don't want to happen is now that this has been put out as a proposal, it's taken as legislation, because it isn't. Families are understandably angry right across the, and when I talk about families of victims of families, I am talking about right across the victims and survivors community. So they are angry, and they have very real and well-founded concerns. They have fought long battles over decades in memory of their loved ones, some of them up to 50 years. And they need to be supported by all of us here. I've also been speaking to many Republicans over recent days, many of whom, like myself, were imprisoned. And this seems to come up time and time again. But they too are concerned that the public messaging seeks to put them in the same category as state forces, as people who want or who would indeed benefit from some form of amnesty. This is a distraction and amounts to another red herring. So let me say yet again, for the record, and speaking as a former political prisoner, the intent here is about covering up Britain's dirty war in Ireland. I also want to make it clear that the only conversations we have had with the British government was to make it clear our total opposition to the amnesty proposals. It is for Boris Johnson and Brandon Lewis and them alone to explain to families their rationale and motivation for bringing these proposals forward. So again, for the record, we totally and absolutely reject this command paper. We in Sinn Féin will continue to work with the families in the pursuit for truth, justice and acknowledgement, and that is right across that community. Across this chamber, we have an opportunity to make common cause and oppose, object and challenge these disgraceful proposals as an affront to victims and survivors. So I urge you to support the motion.
And I call Trevor Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Like my colleague from Northampton, where he outlined in relation to this motion not being ideal, the DUP will continue to lead for alternative measures which are victim-centred and grounded in law and adherence of human rights. That said, an amnesty is no way to address the very legitimate concerns raised by the vexatious pursuit of ageing veterans who served in Northern Ireland, and for the government to firstly evade and now mask their specific duty to the servicemen and women is an act of political cowardice. Once again, the expediency trumps the government's responsibility to the people of Northern Ireland. The vast majority of the servicemen and women acted within the law in the service of everyone in our community. They do not need nor seek an amnesty from prosecution. Placing them on the same footing as terrorists ultimately risks giving succour to those who continue to try and rewrite history and our past and glorifies the actions of terrorists. Much has been said here today, Mr. Speaker, and I listened to Miss Mallon for moving the motion, and I take no pride in saying that I did lose a family member, unlike the member and unlike my colleague. And I can speak on behalf of the victims who are genuinely disappointed by this and were genuinely disappointed in 1998 when the prisoners were released, because that was an affront. But of course, the members opposite didn't make a song and dance about that. Indeed, the previous speaker forgot to mention, I believe he was in receipt of one of the letters for On the Runs. Where was the justice for that, for the victims? This is all about a call today. This is all about a call today in terms of the members and the community. But indeed, the member forgot that. The Deputy First Minister's contribution fell very short, I think, even from the guidance that you give at the outset of this in terms of her conduct. And if anybody is morally bankrupt, she is. She's absolutely morally bankrupt. For I think she was an affront on the innocent victims. My brother-in-law was murdered with 7 of his colleagues. Innocent member of the public, not part of an armed gang, not part of a militia, or whatever the provosts wanted to call themselves. An innocent man carrying out a day's work. To come here today to listen to the hypocrisy of Sinn Féin is nothing short of a disgrace. The security forces is the target of much of the contribution from Sinn Féin today. They targeted them before today, they targeted them with a bullet and the bomb, and now they're targeting them here today in this chamber. I can say I'm proud of the work that the security forces have done in terms of the protection of everyone in this country. I wish others could do the same.
Jerry Kelly, you had a point of order?
I did not get an OTR letter.
Okay, thank you. I call Declan Kearney.
For my got a I speak in favour of the motion. My colleague Michelle O'Neill said that the British Government amnesty proposals are more than about providing legal protection for those who wore uniforms. They are about protecting those who wore suits. The strategic purpose of these amnesty proposals is to protect the policy and decision makers at the heart of the British political, military and intelligence establishment. The shadowy figures and not so shadowy figures. Those whose cabinet decisions and public interventions institutionalised and gave cover to the violence of state forces and their agents. Yes, those who presided over state-sponsored massacres, summary executions of Irish citizens, and who authorised the reorganisation and the arming of unionist paramilitary death squads. This approach is the culmination of a pushback from powerful sections of the British state system who have never ever embraced our peace settlement and who have remained politically and psychologically at war ever since. Be in no doubt, that's what these proposals are about. They are about blocking any investigation of the internment and torture policy, the recruitment of counter-gangs to carry out assassinations within nationalist areas, the use of intelligence and psychological operations, the political approval for shoot-to-kill operations by clandestine military operations, not at the moment, or the role of the Military Reconnaissance Force, the Force Research Unit and the 14th Intelligence Company. That is the clear intent of these proposals. The policy objective of these amnesty proposals is to effectively pour concrete over Britain's role in the conflict, and it is an attempt to formalise legal cover for the de facto impunity and immunity which has protected British forces' actions throughout the conflict. No one in British military intelligence and other state agencies, or from within Thatcher's war cabinet, who supplied unionist paramilitary organisations such as Ulster Resistance with arms shipments from South Africa and elsewhere, and then a Chion Corlia inserted key agents into the controlling positions among the death squads, wants any public scrutiny of their role or actions in the conflict. They fear public exposure and public accountability. And we should indeed be deeply alarmed that these proposals represent a full frontal assault on the Good Friday Agreement and the administration of justice. They propose to halt inquests, judicial reviews, civil cases and cases now before the courts. This is subversion of current due process on an industrial scale. Fundamentally, it's about trying to finally silence the voice of victims, many of whom have been campaigning for truth, justice and acknowledgement on behalf of their loved ones for up to 50 years. It's a travesty that the pain of victims across our entire community, and I make no exception in saying that, should be disregarded so that a Tory manifesto commitment demanded by the British military establishment can be delivered. And it's a mockery of victims' families to suggest that delivering legal impunity for serious human rights abuses, including murder by British state forces, should trump those rights to justice. So, Chion Corlia, we owe it to all victims, to ensure they are treated with equality, dignity and respect. Ní osclafar, bailach a drá na fírinne, na nachhainteras leis na Maltaí seo. There is no pathway to reconciliation within these British amnesty proposals. They have no credibility in this country, and they will be roundly denounced in the court of international opinion. On that basis, Chion Corlia, I urge support for the motion. Takiam sa leis an rún.
Thank you, and I call Sinead McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The British Government's plan to grant an amnesty to state and paramilitary killers is an insult to victims and yet another betrayal of justice. I honestly find it really hard to express my disgust at the British Government's plans that basically denies victims their human rights, and how dare Johnson and Lewis even attempt to frame their amnesty proposals as another step on the road towards reconciliation. I cannot begin to imagine how tough last week's announcement in Westminster must have been for the victims and families of our bloody and murderous conflict. How hurtful that once again those that have suffered the most are being used as pawns and are being poorly served by a government that quite frankly doesn't give two balls of roasted snow for any of them. Because if they did, they would certainly not have decided justice and truth were beyond their reach. As a Foyle MLA, I cannot stand here today without mentioning Bloody Sunday. Innocent civilians were slaughtered on our streets. Families, friends and neighbours were left in complete and utter turmoil. It was unlawful, plain and simple. Despite this, families had been forced into spending a lifetime fighting for justice that continues to be denied. The injustice of Bloody Sunday is in the heart and soul of the people of Derry. This intergenerational trauma cannot simply be wiped away at the behest of a British Prime Minister. I am proud that the MP for Foyle bravely stood on the floor of Westminster and named Soldier F. But I am also ashamed that he had to do it, because it became very clear that the UK government had decided to put justice beyond the reach of the Bloody Sunday families. In January 1972, Soldier F went on an uncontrolled killing spree in my hometown. He deserves recognition for his murderous acts, but more importantly, the Bloody Sunday families deserve justice. The majority of deaths in our conflict were committed by paramilitaries from both loyalist and Republican backgrounds. They preyed on our young people. They stole their futures. The bombing and murdering campaigns of these organisations is still having a profound impact in our communities today. There's not a statute of limitations when it comes to losing a wife, a mother, a father, a husband, a brother, a sister. Yes, life goes on, but so does grief. Today, I'm thinking of the Claudy families. Today, I'm thinking of the Gillespie family in Derry. I want to know exactly who murdered Patsy Gillespie, who gave the instructions that he was to be murdered, who was leading the IRA in Derry at the time, who commissioned his death, why was he picked out? Are his murders still walking around my hometown? These are important questions that need answered, and justice needs to be served. Mr. Speaker, Martin Luther King once said, "Peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice." The UK government, through this proposal, neither want the presence of justice, nor indeed the pretence of justice. The SDLP resolutely rejects this amnesty and any attempt to impose it without the consent of our citizens and without the consent of our victims. I urge you to support this motion.
Thank you. And I call Meg Nesbitt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think if we are going to make progress, we need to be honest. And there have been some shocking examples of the lack of honesty in recent days. Mr. Kelly, sitting opposite, posted a video on Twitter last Thursday in which he said, I quote, "The only way to deal with these issues is through the Stormont House agreement, and let me emphasise, it was an agreement by all the political parties here." That's not true. Another contributor currently aligned to the Alliance Party posted the same untruth on the 14th of July, saying the five parties did get together and agree a way forward. It was called Stormont House because it was literally signed at Stormont House. No, it wasn't. That tweet also asserted that the past is literally that, the past. Well, if that's that person's truth, they are very lucky. Because for thousands of our community, it is literally the enduring present, measured by lost opportunities in employment and education, social inclusion and family life. It's a presence of physical and mental suffering. The honesty that I'm talking about was demonstrated by our Peace Prize laureate, David Trimble, when he used his acceptance speech in 1998 to acknowledge that Unionists, fearful of being isolated on the island, built a solid house, but it was a cold house for Catholics. Now, that acknowledgement does not compromise our view that nobody needed to die or be injured to get to where we are today. But it is an acknowledgement that unionism played a role in creating the environment in which people made bad choices, supporting or indeed carrying out acts of terrorism. But who else in this House is prepared to make a statement of acknowledgement? When I debated the past with the late Martin McGuinness, he was at pains to point out I didn't grow up in Derry as he did, with the implication of discrimination in employment and housing and in voting rights, things which he seemed to think left him no choice but to join the IRA. Well, it's true, I did not grow up in his Londonderry, but John Hume did. And he chose not to pick up a gun. He chose not to detonate a bomb. He chose non-violence as his way forward. And I suggest our other Peace Laureate came a lot closer to his vision of success than Martin McGuinness. And, Mr. Speaker, I declare an interest as a trustee of the John and Pat Hume Foundation. Many say we must fulfil our obligation under Article 2 of the Convention of Human Rights when somebody dies. I agree. But what about our other obligations? Article 3 prohibits torture, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Well, I'm remembering all those people tied to lampposts, put through the public humiliation of tarring and feathering, and remembering those who were subjected to kneecapping, so-called punishment beatings. I'm remembering the words of the late Bobby Storey, who famously talked about subjecting prison wardens to, quote, intense psychological moments. I give way.
I'm reminded by the words of a mentor of mine in his maiden speech in House of Commons, Seamus Mallon, when he said, "Peace is not the absence of war, it is the state of mind. It is a state of mind, a disposition for benevolence, confidence and justice." Would the member agree with me that the British government's command paper in its current form would only serve to expunge any remaining vestige of benevolence, of their benevolence, destroy the people's confidence in the integrity of the London government and eliminate access to justice for victims and survivors and their families?
The member has an additional minute.
I would agree with the member in that assertion, but I also think it is about fulfilling the other obligations under the European Convention of Human Rights. Article 5 offers the right to liberty. The name Jean McConville and the rest of the disappeared springs to mind. Article 6 is the right to a fair trial. How many Maria Cahills were subjected to kangaroo courts? And Article 17, by the way, makes clear that these articles apply to groups and persons, not just to the state. So, no, let us not sign up to any statute of limitations. It would be wrong morally, ethically, politically, but also practically. The command paper at paragraph 11 says where a family doesn't want to dig up the past, we don't need to. Have they never sat with a family divided? I did as a victims commissioner. Brother and sister in a family room at war with each other about whether or not they should pursue truth and justice. Paragraph 20 confirms that the government will disclose fully the information they have and adds the expectation that others will do the same. Did they never listen to Martin McGuinness at Savile? Or read the report of Justice Smithick, who concluded that the IRA evidence with regard to the murder of the officers Breen and Buchanan was not credible? These proposals are dangerously naive. So maybe instead of total success or failure, we should pitch our ambitions at partial success. I've long thought everybody involved should acknowledge their part in creating the toxic legacy that challenges us again today. David Trimble did it for my party a quarter of a century ago. He also
Time's
challenged us
up.
to jump together. So let's restore some dignity to the victims and survivors and some respect to devolved politics.
Thank you. And I call Robin Newton.
And, this is a serious debate. It's an important debate, and it's a debate in support of innocent victims and relatives. Mr. Story has already referred to the incident on the 19th of July 30 years ago when Mr. Tom Oliver was abducted by the Provisional IRA. He was tortured and murdered on this date 30 years ago, and the family now report fresh hope and believe the net is closing in on his killers. They deserve support. And on this date, 1992, an IRA bomb exploded in London, murdering 4 members of the Queen's Life Guards. 12 soldiers and 6 civilians were injured, 7 horses killed. Their relatives deserve support. Tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of Bloody Friday, when Para planted 20 bombs in Belfast and murdered 9 innocent people, injured 130 and terrified thousands. The relatives deserve justice, as do the relatives of every police officer and soldier who stood between us and the terrorists. I suspect I am not the only person who is absolutely astonished to read the words truth, justice and accountability in this motion and see that Sinn Féin members are signatories to the motion. Sinn Féin members know all about the activities of the Provisional IRA, but refuse to provide any information on their atrocities. Information that for many innocent victims would help bring closure. I will give way.
The member opposite refused to give way, and the question that was to be put to him was, will he in this House name those shadowy figures, as he referred to, who are members of the Army Council today, not 50 years ago, but today? If it's truth we want, we need to know who's still in the Army Council.
I agree with the member, and the relatives of innocent victims deserve that information. I remind the House that the Provost targeted innocent people because they were Protestants, because they were Unionists, because they were loyal to the Crown, and murdered also innocent Catholics. The relatives of innocent victims deserve that information. Has Sinn Féin moved? Have they embraced truth, justice and accountability? Emphatically no. These words, when used by Sinn Féin, are in the same vein as Lewis Carroll's character, Humpty Dumpty, and his use of words. In Lewis Carroll's children's book, Through the Looking Glass, replying to Alice, Humpty Dumpty said, "When I use a word, it means what I choose it to mean, neither more or less." That's Sinn Féin's attitude to the words truth, justice and accountability. The words mean whatever they want them to mean. Nothing to do with serving the interests, wishes or needs of innocent victims and survivors. They mean what Sinn Féin want them to mean. DUP leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson said perpetrators should never be able to sleep easy in their beds, and the DUP find the government's suggestion of a statute of limitations, a de facto amnesty, benefiting the terrorists, totally absurd. Anyone who breaks the law should face the threat of prosecution and conviction for their crimes. That should be the principle which everyone unites under. The law should apply equally and be applied without fear or favour. On this very, very sensitive matter, let me quote Belfast Telegraph journalist Gail Walker, who in an excellent article last weekend wrote, "Keeping the peace by inflicting another kind of violence upon survivors, censoring their stories, running a line through the broken heart and hurt mind is quite a narrative." Imagine that being taught in institutes for peace studies throughout the world. Gail Walker has nailed it. Sir Geoffrey Donaldson has reiterated the best way to help Northern Ireland move further along the road to reconciliation is not to sacrifice justice. It is to apply and uphold the rule of law fairly and equally. Relatives of innocent victims deserve the information that is held by many, many people across this land to be provided.
Thank you, and I call Deirdre Hargett.
Thank you very much. I speak in favour of the motion today, and obviously last week we all heard the British Prime Minister state that the legacy proposals would allow us, as he described, draw a line under the Troubles. The arrogance and insensitivity of this statement frankly beggars belief. It is offensive and has offended many victims from right across our community, as we have heard here today. And I think of my own community and the heroic efforts of the Armour Road families, who I stood with just 2 weeks ago and who still await a police ombudsman's report into the atrocity of Sean Graham's bookmakers. Having the audacity to ask families from across our community to forgo truth and justice and to draw a line is beyond insulting, and it's a denial of their fundamental human rights. No victim should be asked to be silent or asked to forgo rights to truth and justice. Victims have a right to know why, after nearly 7 years, the British Government has singularly failed to implement the Stormont House Agreement legacy mechanisms, despite reaffirming 18 months ago a commitment to do that in the New Decade New Approach deal. And it's clear that the British focus is not on the needs of victims, but more about facilitating an amnesty for their forces who were involved in torture, collusion and state killing. And this isn't new. We have seen that with recent communication from the Human Rights Commission that in 2017, 3 years after the Stormont House Agreement, at a British Commons Defence Select Committee, there was a report compiled that looked at options for here, which included a statute of limitations. And indeed, the Human Rights Commission from here at that time said that this was incompatible with international and domestic human rights standards. No victim should be asked to concede their right to truth and justice. That's their fundamental and legal right. Bringing forward an amnesty proposals and asking people to draw lines makes it the deeper systemic and cynical intent by the British state, whose agenda at all costs is to prevent any investigation into their forces' role in the conflict here. Their focus is to protect state agents and special branch handlers who imported weapons from South Africa, and indeed it was stated those who directed the policies right at number 10 Downing Street itself. Meaningfully engaging with the past must be on the basis of legal rights and entitlements for all victims. And experience has shown that a denial of truth, justice and accountability impacts on healing and reconciliation. It's also shown us that is passed to the next generation, and indeed that's what we have seen, where the next generation are taking on the mantle and the campaign on behalf of their loved ones to find truth and justice. No family should be asked to concede their right to an investigation, to draw a line under in the sand. It has to be in line with human rights, and they do have a right to an inquest or a public inquiry. That is their right within law. Denying families their basic human rights is at the core of the British Government's approach to legacy, and it has been for some time, if you look at the details of what they've been talking about. These proposals would not be out of place in a military dictatorship, and the British Government's focus is about prioritising the need of British state forces over victims. It is about amnesties, it's about denying investigations, and it's about avoiding accountability. And this House needs to send a united message, a clear message to the British Government that we need to see the immediate delivery of the rights of all victims and not a further delay or denial. We need to see accountability. We need to see the immediate implementation of the Stormont House Agreement that was agreed 7 years ago. And that has to be done within a human rights compliant manner and in a way that is victim-centred. Truth, justice and accountability are key to healing and building for the future, not asking victims to draw a line onto the past or to forfeit their right to truth and justice. And I've heard the member across the chamber, and you can hear the emotion in the voice, and we can all speak with that. I too have experiences within my own family And I'm sure when you listen around this chamber, but more importantly, out to victims' families themselves, they all feel the same pain, no matter what background, what community, what denomination they come from. They have bled in the same way, they cry in the same way, they grieve for their loved ones in the same way. And I think it is important that we as a House here today send a clear and unequivocal message to the British Government that we support this motion.
Thank you, Cormac. And I call Paula Bradshaw.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to support the motion and welcome the opportunity to speak here today. The Alliance Party has always sought an approach to dealing with the past which is based primarily on the interests of victims and survivors. What we see in the UK Government's command paper is precisely the opposite. The interests of victims and survivors are cast to one side for the sake of political expediency. The Secretary of State, in presenting the command paper in Parliament, claimed that the proposals contained within it would support recovery and reconciliation. I think it is clear, Mr Speaker, that that would do the reverse. I wish to outline why the proposals serve neither the interests of victims, who are supposed to be central to all this, nor, in fact, even the veterans the UK Government thinks it is helping. Firstly, these proposals are all about something that looks like an amnesty and barks like an amnesty, even if that word is inconvenient for the UK Government. Far from putting in place a proper, comprehensive truth recovery process, the UK Government has failed thoroughly in its analysis and in proposing to put in place what it is proposing to put in place will hinder truth recovery and serve only to tip the balance in favour of the offender over the victim. After all, with an effective amnesty in place, what will be the motivation for anyone to tell the truth? This speaks to a profound failure on the part of the UK Government to recognise that the prime reason the current system was not working was that those who carried out the atrocities, by and large, believed and still believe that they were justified in doing so. The proposals will merely mean that those who ruined lives will be even freer to justify their actions openly, perhaps even to the point of justifying specific instances in public without fear of prosecution. Is that really the legacy this Secretary of State wishes to leave behind? These consequences may be unintended, but they only show how poorly thought through these proposals are. They will serve only potentially to traumatise victims further, thus hindering their recovery and harbouring wider societal reconciliation. Nor indeed are all of these victims resident in Northern Ireland. Many of them live in Great Britain, and thus we see Conservative MPs failing to act in the interests of their own constituents. Mr Speaker, I think we need to add, since these proposals follow on from similar proposals concerning veterans who served abroad, that this command paper is not just an insult to victims, but also to the many veterans who served honourably. These proposals leave untouched the distinction between those who served with astonishingly heroic bravery in conditions in the interests of peacekeeping here, and those who themselves oversaw or committed actions which were unjustified and unjustifiable. Many veterans who served honourably now feel that they will not be distinguished from those who were responsible for pain and suffering. The UK Government is being tripped up in its own rush for political expediency. Mr Speaker, this is exactly why we have the rule of law as a basic tenet of democracy. We simply cannot draw a line under the past when our past remains embedded in our society. In the higher levels of mental anguish, in the ongoing control of communities by paramilitaries, and in maintained segregation through sectarian fault lines. The fact is that drawing a line only benefits those who carried out the atrocities, while those who suffered will be re-traumatised. Moving on requires dealing with the past, not pretending to forget, and simply writing justice out of the process. In closing, I would like to thank Amnesty International, the Centre for Administration of Justice, Relatives for Justice, South East Fermanagh Foundation, Pat Finucane Centre, Wave Trauma Centre, and members of former Royal Ulster Constabulary officers and their families for their engagement with the Alliance Party over the last few weeks. Mr Speaker, a feature of the debate in the UK Parliament was that the past is a constant shadow. It certainly is. Engaging in an expedient plan to deny justice only impedes the light. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Patty McGlone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support the motion and welcome the agreement of other parties to our recall of the Assembly to debate the proposals of a Troubles amnesty from the British Government. Our concern at the sudden announcement at the end of June this year of a framework for multi-party talks on Northern Ireland legacy issues has been shown to be justified. These proposals drive a wrecking ball through the previously published agreements between the parties and the Irish and British governments. It breaches the commitment given in the New Decade New Approach Agreement that the British Government would, quote, maintain a broad-based consensus on these issues, recognising that any such UK Parliament legislation should have the consent of the Northern Ireland Assembly, unquote. There is, in fact, broad-based opposition, we're hearing it today, to the British Government proposals. And we have now provided this Assembly with the opportunity to state categorically that these proposals do not have the consent of the Northern Ireland Assembly. The New Decade New Approach Agreement was supposed to build on the Stormont House Agreement of 2014, which had stated that processes dealing with the past should be victim-centred and that legacy inquests will continue. That approach is abandoned in the latest British Government proposals. The decision to halt existing inquests and other civil action in no way addresses the concern expressed in 2014 that the legacy inquest process was not providing access to a sufficiently effective investigation within an acceptable timeframe. As the Northern Ireland Chief Commissioner for Human Rights has pointed out, it disregards the requirements for an effective investigation under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights for victims of the conflict and their families, and it raises profound issues about the rule of law. Indeed, the Commission has previously advised the NIO that a proposed statute of limitations was incompatible with international and domestic human rights standards. The Commission is of the view that the proposal to end current and future inquest shuts down the option of an inquest in getting to the truth, an option through which recent Supreme Court judgments have only just opened the opportunity for greater accountability, as in the Ballymurphy case. That the parties within the Executive Office have failed to make progress on the Stormont House Agreement should not be used as an excuse by the British Government for these proposals. They are shutting the door on the prospect for truth, justice and accountability for victims and survivors. Without that prospect, we will not hear acknowledgement of past wrongs, and without that acknowledgement, there can be little hope for reconciliation. And it is not just the innocent victims of atrocities by state forces like Bloody Sunday and Ballymurphy that the door has been shut on. It is the thousands killed, maimed, beaten and disappeared by the likes of the Provisional Republic movement and their lackeys, and by loyalist paramilitaries. The door is also being shut on Operation Canova and its efforts to shine a light on the allegations of collusion at the heart of the Provisional IRA. I hope that the family of Tom Oliver are right in their reported hope that the net is closing on those responsible for his murder in July 1991. And I trust that John Boucher is right when he says that his team has an understanding of who all was involved in that murder. Yes, certainly.
My sister lives in a farmhouse on the Cooley Peninsula, a farmhouse not far from another farmhouse where Tom Oliver, an innocent farmer, was abducted in the darkness of the night by the shadowy figures of the IRA. Those shadowy figures of the IRA then tortured Tom Oliver, pulling out his fingernails. Those shadowy figures of the IRA then murdered Tom Oliver. Those shadowy figures of the IRA then dumped Tom Oliver's body by the side of the road not far from my home. I remember the shock and the sadness of the morning Tom Oliver's body was found dumped by the side of the road not far from my home by the shadowy figures of the IRA. Does the member agree with me that Tom Oliver's family will be denied justice, given in light of the new DNA evidence available now, denied justice as a consequence of this proposal by the British Government?
The member has an additional minute.
I thank the member for his contribution and his very, very distinct knowledge of that particular atrocious incident. And it is certainly right that the case is a prime example of why Troubles cases should not be closed. While we may be in general agreement here today, we should not ignore the origins of the latest British Government's proposals. The de facto amnesty that the Secretary of State Brandon Lewis has confirmed will apply equally to all Troubles-related incidents is a rerun of the Northern Ireland Offences Bill in 2005. At that time, the SDLP were alone in consistently opposing that bill, a bill that was the outworking of a deal ostensibly between Gerry Adams and Peter Hain. The denial and spin from Sinn Féin around that bill did not withstand the scrutiny of victims' groups, and they were forced to withdraw their support at the last minute. And the current Finance Minister was there on that day. As with the latest proposals, the 2005 bill would have provided immunity for both paramilitaries and members of the security forces from prosecution for Troubles offences. The failure to make progress since then on the vital issue of addressing the legacy of the past has given the current British Government another opportunity to try to close the deal done in 2005. But attempts to seal off the past are doomed to failure. The poison will not be contained, and it will continue to contaminate the present and the future until properly addressed. The way to properly address the past has already been outlined: a comprehensive legacy process through investigations with full police powers. That process requires the commitment by all parties, and the British and Irish governments, to truth, justice, acknowledgement, accountability and reconciliation. I support the motion. Mullum and Roon.
Thank you, and I call Alan Chambers.
Mr. Speaker, back in early 1973, I was employed as the manager of a busy supermarket on the Shankill Road in Belfast. And just before lunchtime one day, police officers came into my shop and they asked me to immediately evacuate the store, as there was a utility van parked across the road that had been hijacked earlier in Ardoyne and was thought to possibly contain a bomb. After securing the store, I made my way to what I consider to be a place of safety beyond the police cordon. Moments later, there was a huge explosion, and a second-floor, large plate glass window blew out and struck me and a colleague on the back and the head. I was obviously in shock, and I couldn't understand why two women who came to my aid fainted at my feet. What I was unaware of was that a huge triangle of glass was embedded and protruding from my back, accompanied by a steady flow of my blood. Travelling in an ambulance packed with walking wounded to the Royal Victoria Hospital, I became paralysed and thankfully induced only by shock. But I was informed by doctors at the hospital attending to me that the glass had missed my spine by less than a quarter of an inch. I had the glass removed and received a number of stitches and carry a scar to this day. I was unable to work for some 6 weeks after the incident. The person who planted that bomb, who made that bomb, who transported the bomb, didn't care who they injured or killed with their actions. Now, I didn't consider myself a victim at the time. I saw victims as the 3,500 poor, unfortunate people who were murdered or killed. Looking back, I was a victim, a very lucky victim by a mere quarter of an inch. I could have had to spend the rest of my life in a wheelchair or worse, just like the over 40,000 injured during the Troubles, many maimed, many with lost limbs, many carrying brain damage, all victims, and many not as lucky as I was that day. The Stormont House Agreement removed any hope that these people injured during the Troubles, many with totally life-changing injuries, would ever see their case investigated. They were considered by some as just collateral damage, a number to be overlooked. My party never signed up to this agreement. I am pleased that they took that position then and continue to maintain it today. There has been much talk and justified outrage by all the parties about the Secretary of State's proposals over lack of accountability and transparency and closure and justice for victims' families. The Stormont House Agreement hardly ticked any of these boxes for many victims' families. Also during the Troubles, Mr. Speaker, I served in the Royal Ulster Constabulary Reserve for some 15 years. I run and organised football teams for police officers to be able to play competitive football. And over about 8 of those officers that I knew personally were killed during the Troubles. Wife left without a husband, children left without a father, and their only crime was wearing a particular uniform. And one officer, Catholic officer, who came from a strong nationalist area, he and his brother both joined the police at a time when it wouldn't have been fashionable for people from that community to join the police. I met him there. He served for 30 years with distinction and achieved high rank in the police, both him and his brother. I met him at a funeral some time ago, and he told me that he was ashamed to tell people that he had served in the RUC, not because anything he had done or anything that he had seen done. He was proud of having served in the police, but because of the rewriting of history that included demonising everyone who ever served in the Royal Ulster Constabulary. How sad that somebody who gave that dedicated professional service should feel that way. And it's the same for the UDR and British Army as well. And you know, an amnesty may remove the threat of a knock on the door for the bad apples, but it does nothing to remove the stain or on the reputation of those who served with honesty and professionalism, putting their life on the line 24/7 to protect and serve this community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. And we're now well in the time of the grace period which we've agreed between myself and the Business Committee. So the last three speakers I'm going to call in a moment. And could I remind people then, under these circumstances, given the lateness of the time, that if members take an intervention, they won't get an additional minute. And I call Claire Bailey.
Thank you, Speaker. And I rise, of course, to support this motion. I also rise very saddened that we are at another, we're seeing more political machinations causing so much hurt and damage to victims and survivors. And we're all aware that this move comes from a Tory manifesto commitment to protect armed forces personnel from litigation. It's not from consultation or conversations with victims and survivors. And Boris Johnson has told us that this amnesty will help Northern Ireland to draw a line in the sand under the Troubles. Well, I haven't believed a word that man has said yet, and I won't be starting with that appalling sentiment. So if he's listening, Mr. Johnson, there can be no peace, there can be no reconciliation without truth and without justice. And it's generally accepted that amnesties as a tool for peace and reconciliation fail to meet and resolve victim and community needs. They fail to deliver justice for the victims of crime. They further a culture of impunity and can reduce trust of a society in its state institutions, something that we can ill afford to heighten. Northern Ireland peace process is held up as a beacon around the world, and yet communities, families and individuals, the victims and survivors who continue to be poisoned by grief and pain of the legacy of our past are being told, draw a line in the sand, get over it, there will be no justice. There are countless studies of intergenerational trauma that show just how complex grief and trauma are causing significant distress and physical and mental disadvantage, not only for immediate victims, but also now for entirely new generations. We have the statistics that highlight the concentration of drug and alcohol problems in the very same communities that were most impacted by the violence. We have the highest rate of suicide in the UK. We have higher incidences of self-harm. We have higher rates for prescriptions to deal with mental ill health. We have higher levels of depression. We do not need a blanket ban on prosecutions. What we do need is a victim-centred, collaborative, inclusive approach to dealing with the legacy of conflict. One that fully recognises cross-generational impacts and redresses the harm that's been caused. This includes actually addressing mental health spending in Northern Ireland. And post-conflict Northern Ireland has been a sponge for peace money. We've received £1.3 billion from the EU since 1995, with a promise of another £1 billion up until 2027. We've received $4 billion in peace-focused grant aid, €120 million from Atlantic Philanthropies, £27 million from the International Fund for Ireland. So a legitimate question is, how have our communities most affected by the violence and by the division seen so little benefit from any of that? The areas which bore the brunt of the conflict remain the most economically and socially disadvantaged 23 years after a peace process began. The problems have become ingrained and deep-seated, and we're leaving it for the next generation to deal with. But we have seen peace-building entrepreneurs, peace-building institutes, some owned by politicians, receiving lots of public money and private donations. It's become a really reasonable notion to think that a divided society is a lucrative business for some, but not for victims and not for survivors, and certainly not for the communities who bear the brunt. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Jerry Carroll.
Thank the members for bringing this motion today. In this debate, Mr Speaker, there should be no doubt that the British state was the main protagonist in fueling violence and conflict here in the north. This is evident if you look at the pattern of repression and violence that was meted out to a peaceful democratic movement for civil rights and the various abuses of power in the early 1970s and onwards. Not least internment, collusion, torture, shoot to kill, the list goes on. And the current Tory plans to impose a statute of limitations to cease prosecutions for incidences during the Troubles will slam the door to those who lost loved ones during the Troubles in terrible circumstances. It is reprehensible, and it amounts to a retrospective licence to kill from a government that does not care one iota for victims here who come from all communities and all deserve justice, whether that be people who lost loved ones at the hands of the state or paramilitary violence. And despite an innumerable amount of platitudes from Boris and his cohorts about moving on, the reality is this plan is designed to do anything but. It's a scheme that provides no truth, justice or accountability for people who lost loved ones. And it's obvious that the Tories, on the one hand, are playing to a specific pro-empire, right-wing voter base and trying to protect their soldiers. But more crucially, they are trying to protect their own establishment and exonerate its crimes in Ireland. What the Boris Johnson government is really interested in is avoiding a situation where the long list of military crimes of the state are aired before the world, in a way that we've seen happen at Bloody Sunday, Ballymurphy inquests and the case of Soldier F. The British Empire, where the sun never set and the blood never dried, has a long history of violence across the world, and they have much to fear from having to own up as to how much of it was sanctioned from the very top rather than the actions of a few rogue individual soldiers. When they got away with it in Ballymurphy, they knew they could get away with it in Derry on Bloody Sunday, and they knew they could get away with it in Springhill and West Rock a year later, as well as in New Lodge and many, many other places. And let's also be clear, Mr Speaker, they're still getting away with it in other parts of the world in more recent years, in Baghdad, Basra, Fallujah, and any other city where British military boots landed to carry out imperialist ventures. If the British Army's crimes here in the north were tried before the courts, the image created by the British establishment of an army sent on a peacekeeping mission between warring tribes would be further shattered. And it would call into question the entire institution of the British military itself, with far-reaching implications for the military and the so-called counter-insurgency expeditions across the world. Boris Johnson's plan to protect those he murdered in cold blood will protect his own state and those who gave the orders, people like General Sir Michael Jackson. while victims and their families who paid the ultimate price for these actions will be denied justice once again. The plans must be ardently opposed because they are not supported by the vast majority of people locally and because they represent an assault on justice. And let's also be clear, it isn't just one section of the community that has an interest in seeking truth and justice. When the state kills its citizens, it's in the interest of all communities to fight for truth and justice, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, neither. And let's of course not forget the devastating role played by the parachute regiment on the Shankill Road itself when they took the lives of Richie McKinney and Robert Johnson, something not often talked about. And we now know that the secret hand of the British state was knee-deep in violence during the Troubles, not just in the early years when they openly gunned down peaceful civil rights protesters, but for decades through more hidden and subterranean ways, including its dirty war, its collusion with paramilitaries through covert military intelligence groups such as the FRU and other intelligence agents working inside paramilitaries who are responsible for the murder of many, many innocent people. And again, to emphasise, those who were killed by paramilitaries will also be negatively impacted by these plans, which are not supported by the victims' groups who represent them. We need to see a process which offers a fair chance at justice to the families of every victim of the Troubles, rather than trying to bury their experiences and their grief. Today, I resolutely oppose Boris Johnson's perverse, dangerous, reactionary plans, and my solidarity goes out to every single victim and their families who continue to fight for truth and justice against the many, many barriers and obstacles placed in their way. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Claire Sugden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Albeit in a different context, but no less relevant, Willie Bach, Chair of the Bach Commission, said in 2017, "It is, after all, fairly simple. Unless everybody can get some access to the legal system at a time in their lives when they need it, trust in our institutions and in the rule of law breaks down. When that happens, society breaks down." Mr. Speaker, Northern Ireland society is broken and remains broken because for many they have not had access to justice, and these proposals remove any hope of that. I rise to support this motion, if only to defend and uphold the integrity of justice. My father came to Northern Ireland in the 1970s. He was a member of the British Army. He was also a son and he was also a brother. And for him, he was a young soldier from North Yorkshire, tasked in Northern Ireland to protect all at a time of severe conflict when many people were losing their lives. It was the same when he was a prison officer. His job was to protect the people in his care, not to pass judgment, not to undermine or interfere, but to do a job that he felt was one of looking after others. And I ask him about this regularly, and he gives me the same answer. He was there to protect others. My father does not represent every British soldier or every prison officer or any other service in Northern Ireland during that period, but I expect he represents most. Proud people who believe they were protecting others. I acknowledge that some crossed the line, stepped out of sight of their role, and their motivation is a separate conversation, but what is important today is the difference between doing their job and committing a crime. If crime was committed, then those individuals should be held to account in law for their actions, as they would be in any other environment or any other circumstance. Not doing so actually undermines people like my father, because it suggests that criminal behaviour is acceptable in the armed forces. That's not the service, certainly not the service that he joined. Indeed, he would have not joined had it been. And a core tenet of any armed force is upholding the law, or at least that's what most believed. And it is shameful that the current Conservative government wants to retrospectively stain good, decent servicemen and servicewomen by saying that those who broke the law amongst them are equal to them through a statute of limitations, saying that they're equal to terrorists who sought violence and who sought to create victims dressed up as a cause. I asked my father yesterday about the proposals and asked him would he support this, and he said to me, as a former soldier, if you break the law, you must face the consequences of that. As Minister of Justice, I was keen to harness humanity within the system, recognise that the process involves people, and I sought to meet with victims and their families. I met with families from Enniskillen, from Ballymurphy, from Kingsmill, from Omagh. And I felt it was important to listen and recognise them as mothers, fathers, sons, daughters of those they had lost. And of course, I respected the families to be aware of the circumstances that led to those meetings. See that room in Castle Buildings? What I recall from each family was the same look in their eyes. Deep-set trauma, searching for answers. Also, younger members of those families that attended those meetings with no direct experience or even recollection of the atrocities, maybe not even born, had that same look in their eyes too. So no, time will not be a healer. That trauma is passing from generation to generation because it hasn't been addressed. And these proposals do not address. They attempt to draw a line and ask victims to move on. Victims will never move on. They can accept, but they need answers to do that. It is not enough to provide space for truth, as proposed by the Secretary of State. Yes, of course, people want answers, but justice must follow. Otherwise, what is the purpose of truth other than to further torture victims by denying the fundamental right of justice? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. And I now call Matthew O'Toole to wind and conclude on the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if you were to walk from this chamber across the Great Hall and into the Senate chamber, you would pass by two striking and hopeful quotes from two of our most famous writers, Seamus Heaney and C.S. Lewis. You would also, on the way, pass memorials to two particularly shocking killings from what we call the Troubles: the murder of Norman Strong, former Speaker of the Stormont Parliament, and his son at Tynan in 1981, and the stabbing to death of Senator Paddy Wilson, a member of my party, and Irene Andrews in 1973. While these acts were especially gruesome, the purpose of me pointing them out is rather to draw attention to how surrounded we are in this society by trauma and the memory of trauma. Around 3,500 people were killed during the Troubles over the course of 2.5 or 3 decades. That number, over the course of 3 decades, that number may seem small in comparison to many other conflicts, but in a geographically confined space with a small population, the rippling waves of psychological impact on relatives, friends, and even children born since the end of the conflict have been enormous. And we've heard that repeatedly from members of this chamber today. We've heard personal experience offered today, including from Mr. Chambers, who offered a very striking account of his encounter with violence in this society in the early 1970s, and others have, Mr. Clark, and indeed others have too. Not all of us have lost a close family member, but everyone, all of us, is affected. We all have a profound stake in how we deal with the past. We all want, we all need an agreed and appropriate means of dealing with the past. But as has been made clear in today's debate, none of the parties in the Northern Ireland Assembly believe that what the British Government proposed last week is an appropriate means of dealing with the past. Why? Because it doesn't attempt to deal with the past. It seeks to sweep atrocity, injustice and trauma under the carpet in order to deliver a Conservative manifesto pledge to end prosecutions for servicemen. In order to further perpetuate the myth of vexatious prosecutions of veterans, propagated by right-wing tabloids and some Tory backbenchers, the British Government wants to close down every avenue of justice and legal recourse, civil and criminal, for families who have lost loved ones to both paramilitaries and the security services and still have had no means of accountability. There are members of this Assembly who themselves have lost family members as a result of the Troubles. And while it is important to acknowledge, as others have done today, including Mr Nesbitt, who speaks obviously with experience as a former Victims Commissioner, that not all victims and survivors share exactly the same perspective on how they want their cases handled, it is true that the reaction to last week's proposals, the proposed amnesty, has been universally negative from victims' groups. I want to quote one. I'll give away briefly.
With me that the British Government's proposals deny support, remorse, truth and justice to the families, the Reevey family in Whitecross, the families of the murdered Kingsmill massacre victims, Majella O'Hare's family on the Ballymire Road, Patrick Kerr's family, Philip Allen and Damien Traynor shot dead in Points Pass as they sat and drank as friends in Callum's bar. This proposal by the British Government denies those families support, remorse, truth and justice.
Well, the member my colleague has offered some particularly striking examples of people who are being denied justice if this proposal becomes law. Sandra Peake, the Chief Executive of Wave Trauma Centre, whom all of us will be familiar with, says the government wants to draw a veil over the past, but there isn't a veil thick enough to hide the blood and bones of thousands of victims or to muffle the cries of their families. The beginning of today's motion refers to the need for victims and survivors to have a full, material and central role in the design of legacy structures. That, of course, has not happened. The British Government has published a document which has united victims' groups and parties here in opposition to its sheer cynicism. I want to respond on some of the comments made by members across the Chamber, but I first want to briefly touch on the proposals put forward by the UK Government. They are not just cynical, but they, in the command paper itself, I should say, that the UK Government says that appropriate safeguards will be put in place to prevent the release of information that would threaten national security. Of course, no definition or worked example is offered as to how such a test would be applied or who would make it. Many families from Bloody Sunday to Ballymurphy to Loughlin Island and many others who believe the state has an interest in preventing full disclosure of information relevant to their family's killing will treat with profound scepticism any promise of full or voluntary disclosure by the state. Mr Speaker, isn't this command paper itself justification for that scepticism? What exactly is the state saying to victims? It is saying, trust us. Trust us. We are walking away from another international treaty obligation only 18 months after recommitting ourselves to that obligation. We are unilaterally proposing suspension of the rule of law as applied to thousands of murders over 3 decades, and not only the criminal law, but we want to suspend any legal route to accountability via inquest, civil litigation or ombudsman. We are going to do all this, but trust us. We will disclose any relevant information unless we decide we don't want to. Do they think that victims are fools? The other large claim in last week's paper is that a statute of limitations would maximise opportunities for information recovery. On what evidence is this claim based? Mr Nesbitt touched on this as well. If this were true, then presumably there would be a clear record of ex-paramilitaries and, where relevant, members of the security forces offering information to families once the threat of prosecution had been removed. The evidence of the Savile inquiry showed that not to be the case. Indeed, the evidence of the Smithick Tribunal, which Mr Nesbitt referenced, also showed that. Has the government been told by paramilitary groups that their members would be honest and forthcoming in information disclosure should the possibility of criminal prosecution be removed? I think we should be told if they have. To touch, Mr Speaker, on some of the contributions, I won't touch on all of them because they were thorough and they were fulsome. It's clear that there is very strong support for this motion, but there are differences both of emphasis and of message from people in this chamber, and it would be dishonest, I think, to pretend that there is a complete unanimity of emphasis, but there is, I think, unanimity of opposition to what the UK Government is proposing, and that is extremely important. Mervyn Storey said very pointedly, he talked about the need, he said that victims, his party did not support victims being treated in this way, and we welcome that. He also drew attention, and several colleagues did, including my colleague Justin McNulty, the experience of Tom Oliver. And the Tom Oliver case is one which highlights to us why it isn't simply good enough to close the door on potential criminal investigation on the basis of what the UK Government have offered. New evidence has apparently come to light in the Tom Oliver case, and I would hope, and I'm sure all in this House would hope, that further progress can be made in offering some justice and accountability to his family. Doug Beattie talked about, as others did from his party, about the Stormont House agreement and the fact that our motion mentions the Stormont House agreement. Well, it is true, Mr Speaker, that the Stormont House agreement is not perfect, but it's also true that it is a practical way forward that has a significant amount of buy-in from victims. It does not have unanimity. It is not perfect. It's very far from being perfect, but it's a lot better than what the UK Government is doing. I would also say gently that given the UK Government is very falsely and disingenuously claiming that there's no way forward, the Northern Ireland political parties can't possibly agree on anything in relation to legacy, so we should just junk everything and do what we want to suit our own agenda. I would be very cautious about allowing them to make that argument. Others, I need to make progress, so I won't give way, I'm afraid. There were very many comments that were made. It was strikingly pointed, several speakers, of course, pointed out the disingenuity of the UK state in terms of their message around protecting vexatious prosecutions. That was striking in last week's statement from Brandon Lewis. At several points, he was offered from Tory backbenchers the opportunity to cynically endorse this line about vexatious prosecutions, and he did it time and time again. That, I'm afraid, shows the real evidence of what lies behind his motivation. Nicola Mallon, my colleague who proposed the motion, mentioned his cynical Daily Telegraph article, which did precisely the same thing. It is true that there are real and dark interests in the security forces and in Whitehall who would rather that the full details of what happened here did not come out. It's also worth saying, and I would be remiss if I didn't reflect in winding, that victims of paramilitaries, including the IRA, are as entitled to truth and justice as anyone else. And I'm standing today, and my party is standing today, with all victims who seek justice, both from paramilitaries and also from those members of state forces who took life unlawfully. And I would also reflect on the point that was made by several people around the state taking life and how service people shouldn't be put on the same level as paramilitaries. I think the important thing to reflect on is not that all state actors or that all individual members of the security forces behaved in that way. It's that where crimes were committed, those crimes are the same and they should be treated the same. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, we should all want to find a way of healing, of easing the pain of those who have suffered most. We should all want to find a way of remembering and moving on from a squalid and futile conflict which scarred so many. But we can't pretend those scars don't exist. Burying our past at the whim of Boris Johnson and his immoral government is not something we can countenance. I mentioned quotes in this building at the start of my remarks from Seamus Heaney and C.S. Lewis. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Heaney joins us. There are far, far better things ahead of us than any that we leave behind, said C.S. Lewis. It should be all our jobs, Mr. Speaker, to make real those sentiments, especially for those among us who carry the pain of loss. And that is why we should all oppose this lawless and immoral amnesty from a lawless and immoral UK government. And I commend this motion to the Assembly.
Thank you. And the question is that the motion standing on the order paper be agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The motion stands. Thank you. The item 3 on the order paper is the adjournment. And before I put the question, I remind members that the Assembly will next sit on Monday, the 13th of September 2021, as scheduled. The question is that the Assembly do now adjourn. The Assembly is adjourned. Thank you.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Plenary Programme Sound. This is the Northern